In this video, we're going to solve quadratic word problems by using the quadratic formula. So the first type of word problem we're going to look at is we're going to take a look at these vertical motion word problems. So make sure you have this generic equation written down in your notes. So that's h, or our height, equals negative 16t squared plus v sub 0t plus h sub 0t. And then remember what these four variables mean. So remember that our h value is equal to the height. So this is the height of an object, and it is the vertical height. So it's how far it's going up. Then the t value represents time, which for vertical motion problems will be represented by seconds. Then v sub 0 is the initial vertical velocity. So this is its initial speed going upwards or downwards. And then h sub 0 is the initial vertical height. So this is dealing with vertical motion. Anything with h represents a height, anything with a v represents velocity, and then this little sub 0 represents its initial, basically meaning at time equals 0. So now let's read through this word problem together. It says a juggler tosses a ball into the air. The ball leaves the juggler's hand 4 feet above the ground and has an initial velocity of 30 feet per second. Write an equation to represent this situation. So we're going to start with that part first because that's our first instruction. So we're going to write an equation here to represent this situation. Well, we know that vertical motion is represented by this equation in general. So we have h equals negative 16t squared plus the initial velocity times t plus the initial height. So let's find that key information there. What I notice right off the bat is that our initial velocity is equal to 30. Our initial height is when it's released, so that's equal to 4. And as a result, we're able to substitute into this equation all the values we need. So we have h is equal to negative 16t squared plus 30t plus 4. So here is the equation that we need in order to solve the rest of this situation. So now that we have an equation, let's look at part 2. And this says, then determine how long the ball is in the air if the juggler catches the ball when it falls back to a height of 3 feet. So what we're trying to find is we want to find the time when h is equal to 3. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this value of 3 and we're going to substitute it in here for h. So if we rewrite this, we have 3 equals negative 16t squared plus 30t plus 4. And this is the quadratic equation that I need to solve. So if I take a look at this equation here, what I notice is that it's almost perfectly set up for the quadratic formula. All I need to do here is subtract 3 from each side, and if I do so, it's then set equal to 0. So I have 0 equals negative 16t squared plus 30t plus 1. So this is now set up for the quadratic formula. So I find my values for a, which is negative 16, b, which is 30, and c, which is 1. And then I can substitute these into the quadratic formula. So here I take x equals negative b, which is 30, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 30 squared, then minus 4 times negative 16 times c, which is 1, all over 2 times negative 16. Now, I'm going to use keep change here because that's just easier for me so I don't make an error. Now that I've substituted, I'm going to simplify that part underneath the square root. So I have x equals negative 30 plus or minus the square root of 964 all over negative 32. Now with the problems we've done so far, we've simplified the square roots, but because this is a word problem, we want to make a little bit more sense of this particular situation, so we're actually going to estimate that square root. We're going to take the square root of 964 and we're going to estimate it out. So we have x equals negative 30 plus or minus 31.05, all divided by negative 32. So we're going to write that out there, and then we're going to just estimate what the time would be. So again, typically we simplify that square root and we leave it as a simplified square root, but since this is a word problem, we're actually going to estimate it out with some decimals. So now let's split this out. So we have negative 30 plus 31.05 divided by negative 32. And that becomes 1.05 over negative 32, which if I divide that out gives me a time of negative 0.03 seconds, which really doesn't make much sense. Let's see what that second option becomes. So we have a negative 30 minus 31.05, all divided by negative 32. And that becomes a negative 61.05 over a negative 32. And if I divide that out, I find that I get a time of approximately 1.91 seconds. And that to me makes a little bit more sense. So here's our answer down here of 1.91 seconds, which means if we release it at 4 feet and we catch that ball at 3 feet with an initial velocity of 30 feet per second, we will catch the ball about 1.91 seconds later. So in this example, we're going to go back to our knowledge of area, and we're going to find the x value for this particular triangle that will make that triangle have an area of 8 feet. So first we have to think about what we already know about triangle area. First, we know that triangle area is equal to, you can either write it as base times height divided by 2, or you can write it as area equals 1/2 times base times height. They're the same thing. I tend to like the first one, but if you like the second one, that's okay too. They aren't wrong. So what we're going to do here is we're going to substitute all the values that we know into this area equation. So the first thing I note is that I have an area of 8 feet. So I'm going to write my area as 8 equals my base, which is x plus 1, times my height, which is 3x minus 7, all divided by 2. So that's my original equation. And to me, that looks a little bit messy, but I have some rewriting tools I can use in order to make that look a little bit nicer. So we substitute in the values that we know to start. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't really like this denominator down here, this big division of 2. I don't like having a fraction, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to multiply both sides of this equation by 2, because that will cancel out the 2 on the right-hand side and will allow me to just have 16 equals x plus 1 times 3x minus 7. Now, I can see this is a quadratic because I can see if I multiply this out, I'm going to get an x squared. And thinking about all of the strategies I know for quadratics, I know I'm going to have to multiply this whole thing out to start setting it up so I can actually solve it. So let's start by multiplying out the parenthesis parts so that we can combine some things together and maybe find a quadratic strategy that will help us find the value for x. So if we multiply this out, we end up with 16 equals, that becomes 3x squared minus 7x plus 3x minus 7. And then if we combine some like terms here, we get 16 equals 3x squared minus 4x minus 7. And then if I look at this, I notice that I can use the quadratic formula here if I can get that 16 to the other side. So if I subtract 16 here, I end up with 0 equals 3x squared minus 4x minus 23. So now that I've set this up for the quadratic formula, I'm going to find values for a, b, and c, and then I'm going to substitute them into my quadratic formula. So I have x equals, that becomes negative 4, which I know is going to become a positive 4, plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared minus 4 times a, which is 3, times c, which is negative 23. Then I'm going to utilize keep change there to make my life a little easier. And that's all divided by 2 times 3. So I start off by substituting all of those values into my equation. Then from here I'm going to simplify that part underneath the square root. So I leave the rest alone. I have 4 plus or minus the square root all over 6, and I need to figure out what number is underneath that square root. Now I do want to pre-warn you here, make sure you're very, very careful and you use parentheses. That negative 4 squared needs to become 16. And then when you do the negative 4 times 3 times negative 23, that together becomes a positive 276. So if we add those two together, we get a square root of 292. Now, again, since this problem is a word problem, we are going to actually evaluate that square root out. If this was the other problems that we were solving, we do simplify the square root, but here you can use decimal approximation since we want an actual value for x that we can relate to. So here we can square root 292, and we end up with about 17.09. So I can now write x equals 4 plus or minus 17.09 divided by 6. And then I can split this into my two answers of 4 plus 17.09 divided by 6. So if I do 4 plus 17.09, I get 21.09 divided by 6, which gives me a value of approximately 3.52 feet. Then if I do the next one, I get 4 minus 17.09 divided by 6. So that gives me about negative 13.09 divided by 6, which gives me an x value equal to about negative 2.18 feet. So if I look at my two answers here, the negative one doesn't make sense in the context of the problem, so I know that my x value is equal to 3.52 feet. So if you take that x value of 3.25 and you substitute it in for your base and your height, you will end up with an area of 8 feet squared.